Check, check. All right. Hi, everyone. Oh, I can't believe we've reached the final week of class. Semester really flew by. So today, we're going to begin to cover the final chapter in our course textbook, which is, of course, all about the nature and existence of God. So the big question, maybe the biggest one, depending on the importance of the question, to you, that is. So, I'm going to start it off with some stuff that actually isn't really mentioned by Crumley at all. Well, here's what is mentioned at the very start of the chapter. This is, of course, a metaphysical question. Does God exist? And if God exists, what is God like? Right? A set of metaphysical questions. That's what metaphysics is all about. Metaphysics is the study of reality, the study of um, what exists, what kinds of things exist, and what are those things like, to give you the Wikipedia definition, I suppose. So we're not really doing theology today, although we're certainly bumping up against some theological questions and talking about the work of uh, philosophers who were also just as much theologians as they were philosophers. Um, but I want us all to try and be nice to one another, right? Because of course this can be a sort of sensitive or provocative topic for some people. This, by the way, of course, is the creation of Adam. I wasn't sure what sort of imagery to include in this slide, or in this set of slides, rather. Of course, this is a depiction of God from the Abrahamic tradition. This is, by this, you'll find this on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo. Not all religions depict God the same way. Some don't really depict him as a human at all. For example, you wouldn't get this kind of representation of God in Islam, for example. And then, of course, there are many other religions outside of the Abrahamic tradition as well. So there's lots of different positions that one can take with respect to the question, does God exist? And these are not really all mentioned by Crumley, but I figured that it would be worth mentioning them here. So I put down as many as I could think of. Of course, most of us are, if we believe in God, not all of us do, are going to be theists or deists. So theism is the idea that there is a God, and that God also actively intervenes in the universe. So God does things. He, I don't know, for example, answers prayers or performs miracles or something, right? That's theism. So theism is a God of a personal God, right? And we can contrast that with deism, where we have a sort of impersonal God, a God that exists but doesn't really get involved in the workings of the universe. He sort of creates the universe, sets up all the laws of physics and gets the machine going, sets the clock running, as it were. But after that, doesn't really do anything. Of course, you can be a polytheist, where you don't just believe in one single god, but many gods. And of course, the ancient Greeks were polytheists, right? the ancient Romans. Sometimes Hinduism is described as polytheistic, and I guess you can look at it that way, but you can also look at it as, and there's actually a box on this in this chapter. You can actually understand Hinduism in a monotheistic way, where all of the different gods are really just aspects of Brahman or the world soul, right? You could decide to be a pantheist, where God is just identical with nature. Um, so sometimes Spinoza, for example, Baruch Spinoza, is described as a pantheist, because he famously said God or nature. Sometimes, though, he's also described as a panentheist. And a panentheist is somebody who believes that God is immanent or within nature. So it's kind of like an immanent version of pantheism, or a pantheism on which God is immanent, not just the identity statement. Of course, you can also deny that God exists. You can just simply lack that belief, and that falls under the broad category of atheism. And some people understand atheism this way, where we have a sort of strong and a weak version. This is, if I'm not mistaken, due to Antony Flew, the philosopher Antony Flew, who uh, describes weak atheism as just a lack of belief. And strong atheism is a belief, like a negative belief, like you believe there is no God. Sometimes agnosticism is included under the weak atheism umbrella. Agnosticism is the idea that we just can't know um, whether there's a God or not. And anti-theism is the position where maybe one doesn't want there to be a God. Ooh. Oh, the air's awfully dry in my apartment today. So those are a number of different ways you can look at the question. Now, as I mentioned today, we'll be looking at primarily theistic or deistic understandings of God. So, as I mentioned before, the God of the Abrahamic religions. So, if you're talking something like Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, you've got a theistic God, a personal God who actually does things, intervenes in the universe, answers your prayers, maybe performs some miracles, things like that. But a lot of the philosophers that we've discussed throughout the term also believe in a deistic God. And sometimes that's called the God of the philosophers. Sometimes you'll hear it called a watchmaker God for reasons that we'll get to later today. So that's primarily what we'll be looking at, although we will mention some other conceptions of God. And usually our personal God has these divine attributes. God is usually understood as omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, eternal, and immutable. And of course, there's another divine attribute that is omnibenevolence. So God is supposed to be all good. We're not going to talk about omnibenevolence today. We're going to save that for Wednesday when we discuss the problem of evil. That is, of course, the problem of whether an omnibenevolent God is compatible with the nature or with the existence of evil. The argument goes that it's not. So, but we'll save that for Wednesday. Let's look a little bit further into these divine attributes, and then what I would like to do is try and cover the first two arguments for the existence of God, which are the argument from design and the cosmological argument. We'll save the ontological argument for next time because it's a little more it's a little more difficult to get one's head around that one. Anyway, divine attributes. First one is omnipresence. If you are omnipresent, you are everywhere. So omnipresence means being everywhere. And the sense in which God is everywhere differs, whether you're a pantheist or a panentheist on the one hand, or a theist or a deist on the other. So if you're a pantheist, God just is nature. If you're a panentheist, God is everywhere in the sense that he's in everything. Um, he's being through everything in the universe. In fact, it really is a misnomer to refer to him as a he on pantheism, because not only is he nature, he's immanent within nature. But if you're a deist or a theist, you probably understand God's omnipresence a little bit more along the lines that Thomas Aquinas understood it. And Aquinas understands omnipresence in terms of power and knowledge. So God is present everywhere in the sense that there's nothing that's outside of God's knowledge or power. So God isn't everywhere in the physical sense for Aquinas. He's not physically present everywhere, but rather God is maybe more like the laws of nature, right? You know, if you know your physics, you know about this idea of symmetry, that the laws of physics are the same throughout the universe. The laws of physics here on Earth are the same as they are on, you know, some planet halfway across the universe. The same laws are present everywhere. God would be like that on this understanding. So God is not physically everywhere. He's everywhere in the sense that he can know about anything, anywhere, at any time, or do anything anywhere at any time. So, and this makes sense. This starts to make more sense when you understand that Aquinas actually sees God as existing outside of time. So it's not like he's going around within the universe doing things. That's already kind of decided from eternity what Aquinas or what God is going to do and when. So that's omnipresence. There's an omnipresence joke I heard once in a philosophy seminar. The professor said, that must be awfully exhausting, omnipresence being everywhere all the time. And one of the students piped up and said, well, but God would also always be on vacation, so it wouldn't really be that bad. I thought that was funny. Now there's omniscience. Oh, outside of time? Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. There is a sense in which God is either within time, like oh, finally I've got some birds at my bird feeder. Sorry. There's a sense in which you can understand God as existing within time, like God has a past and a future, or God exists outside of time. So the whole series of events that is the universe would be immediately available to him. And it's not like he would have a past and a future because he's kind of outside of that. Okay, omniscience means all knowing. So if you are omniscient, you know everything that there is to know. And again, Crumley goes to Aquinas here, who pointed out that human knowledge is knowledge that is mediated by something, mediated by reasons, for example. But God's knowledge is unmediated, so it's direct. So all truths are immediately available to God. Um, sometimes, sometimes we say that God's knowledge is intuitive, where ours is not, right? Ours depends on concepts, on reasoning. God just kind of knows everything, right? So everything that there is to know, God can know and does know. Then we've got omnipotence. Well, that's all. I guess that's all he knows. But does he know all, right? If Santa Claus does not know, for example, if he does not know all of the events of world history, plus all of the laws of physics, in addition to whether everyone has been bad or good, I wouldn't say that he's omniscient. Um, but who knows? So if you're omnipotent, and this is one of the tricky ones, omnipotence, that means you're all powerful. And God is supposed to be um, all powerful. He's supposed to be able to do anything, or really anything that can be done. Um, God is supposed to be able to do it. Now, some put a limitation on this. Some theologians say that God cannot do what is logically impossible. So, for example, God could make, I think one of the examples in the book is a mountain made out of gold. So, God could make a mountain out of gold. That's something that for us is physically impossible. But God could not make a square circle, or a married bachelor, or a colorless red object, or a four-sided triangle, right? Because those things are just logically impossible, right? There's no such thing as um, a square circle, right? Well, if he could, here we're going to get to an interesting thing. Um, he's so God is supposed to be able to do things that are physically impossible. That's what miracles would seem to be, right? If you believe in miracles, um, you believe that there are physically impossible things um, that God causes to happen. Um, so I'm talking like Old Testament miracles, like um, helping Moses part the Red Sea, right? Yeah, exactly. That's where we're headed with this. The physical impossibility consideration gets us to the stone that's so heavy that even God can't lift it, right? Um, now, we want there to be limits on God's ability to do logically impossible things, because those things just aren't really things, right? Like if you were to ask God, can you make a square circle? God would say, no, I can't, but it's not because of a lack of ability on God's part. It's because um, a square circle is an absurd concept, right? It's not something that can logically exist. Um, but miracles are no problem. The physically impossible is no problem. So do you see why it's not really a limitation to say that God can't do what is logically impossible, right? It's not really placing a limit on his power, just saying, well, it's kind of like God can't break his own rules. If God invented the world and the world includes the rules of logic, um, God can't break his own rules, right? He can't violate his own nature. Um, So that's why it's not really a limitation. These theologians who place this limitation on God say that, well, it's not really a limitation because we're not limiting God's power. We're just describing the limits of things that can exist. But now we can also circle back to the physical impossible stuff, right? Um, could he make a rock so massive that even he couldn't lift it? This is the old riddle, right? If he can make such a rock, there's something that he still can't do, lift the rock. But if every rock that God makes he can lift, then there's something else that he can't do. That is make a stone so heavy that even he cannot lift it. So either way, there's something we find that God isn't capable of doing, and it's supposed to be a physical thing that he's not capable of doing. However, some would say this is actually a matter of logical impossibility, not physical impossibility. Um, so if we say that oh, God actually cannot make a stone so heavy that he could not lift it. Um, we're we sound like we're talking about a physical constraint, but there are those who would say that what we're actually doing is still in the realm of logic. We're still in the realm of logical possibility there. Maybe we could just say, to sort of dispense with these worries, that God is maximally powerful. So, whatever can be done, God has the power to do it. But there are some things that simply cannot be done, like drawing a square circle or a four-sided triangle. These things just don't make sense, right? And good old Thomas Aquinas would say God can't violate his own nature, so God can't break his own rules, as it were. Now, this gets us to the omnibenevolence question, right? God is supposed to be all good. So can he do something evil or allow evil to happen? We're going to look at that more next time, but that's basically what's at the root of the problem of evil. That is the idea that the existence of evil and the existence of an omnibenevolent God are incompatible with one another. So either God is all good, and what we think is evil is not really evil, or evil exists. So God either doesn't exist or God cannot be all good, right? So the problem of evil goes after one of those core divine attributes. But again, we'll talk about this a little bit more next time. Well, it's not really who created it. What do you mean exactly? Do you mean um who coined the term problem of evil, or do you mean like, oh, is it whose fault is it, God's or Satan's? Oh, the philosopher. I don't know. It's talked about in various forms. Um, I think probably the one of the earliest thinkers to articulate it was Lucretius. And he's actually really more of a poet. Um, or maybe it was Epicurus. Epicurus. I'm actually not sure. Maybe somebody can Google this, but it comes from a poem on the nature of things. Yeah, Epicurus. Yeah. Um, and he articulates this problem really well. Um, let me try and find it. Let me pull it up. I want to pull up the exact line. This actually would have been good to include in these slides. I'll have to make that change for next time. But I can find the exact line. Um, Right. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? That's the line from On the Nature of Things, where, among other things, we find the problem of evil expressed. So, another important divine attribute is eternality. So God is supposed to be eternal, right? God is supposed to have always existed, and God is supposed to always exist. He will always exist. And there's a couple of ways we can understand this. That we can understand him as eternal within time, or as eternal outside of time, a sort of atemporal God. Now, if he exists in time, then his existence stretches infinitely back and infinitely forward. The example Crumley uses is a number line. If you imagine all of history as a sort of number line, then God exists on the entire line, going forward and backward. But if God is timeless, then God is separate from the number line and can perceive the entire number line. Now, a lot of religions see God as a being that can act within time. God can perform miracles, for example. Let's think about the God of the Abrahamic religions. Um, he's always visiting people, or listening to prayers, or performing miracles, or sending messages. Sometimes he's actively intervening in the affairs of his people. So in the Old Testament, especially, God is destroying cities and whatnot, right? He's killing the firstborn. He's really getting his hands dirty, so to speak, right? Um, in Christianity, God even becomes a person if you believe in Christianity, right? God is uh, uh, Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus Christ, and uh, Jesus, I guess, takes on all the sins of everybody, right? So God kind of becomes human, and um, is punished for the sins of everyone. And this is kind of like supposed to be a new sort of covenant, a new deal, as you will. And again, don't ask me about too many of the specifics. It's been a while since I've taken anything on Christian thought. Um, Although I did have a good couple of classes on Christian thought as an undergrad. But I'm not religious, right? So I don't really know a lot of the finer details beyond all the broad strokes. So, um, the point is that like, if you look at what is in the Bible, for example, you see a God that um acts within time, all the time, not like a deistic God. Um, if you are a deist, then you probably believe that God is atemporal. Maybe he starts the universe going and then doesn't do anything after that. If you're a deist, then you might be perfectly comfortable with the idea of the Big Bang. What was before the Big Bang? Well, it doesn't matter. It was just, God did the Big Bang and set up all the laws of physics and started everything going, and then doesn't really do anything after that. So that would be a deistic God. Although Aquinas believes in a personal God, and still says that God is atemporal, right? Aquinas says that maybe what happens is that God has decided everything from eternity, from an atemporal position. So even when he does intervene within the universe, he's not actually acting in time, because the decision to act where and when um, has already taken place from outside of time, if that makes sense. Um, we're talking about Aquinas a lot here, and remember, Aquinas's understanding of God is informed a lot by Aristotle's metaphysics. Um, so as I've said previously, right, Aristotle casts a long shadow. Um, anyway, another divine attribute is immutability. God isn't supposed to change; he's immutable. So, after all, God is supposed to be this perfect being. Why would God have to change if he's already perfect? Doesn't need to change. This is an idea that actually is traceable back to Plato, right? Plato's perfect forms were supposed to be immutable, and Saint Augustine, Boethius, and Saint Thomas Aquinas all agree God is immutable in the same way that the form of like the perfect forms are immutable. They're unchangeable, they're uncorruptible and impassible. Incorruptibility, by the way, is a weaker notion. uh, it's related to the idea of immutability or unchangeability, but it's not as strong as the notion. It just says that there's no change, there can be no changes in God's character. And impassibility, again, similar but weaker, says that God is not really susceptible to mental states like emotions or feelings. Um, depending on which religion you look at, whether God or even the gods are immutable is up for debate for sure. I mean, if you look at polytheistic religions, the gods are really like just bigger, more powerful versions of us, right? So think of the Greek or Roman stories. Indian gods are all are there's seemingly an infinite number of them. The Norse gods maybe are a little bit more like the Greek and the Roman gods, but still pretty different. They're all just big, giant, more powerful people, right? Well, yeah, this is the other thing, right? Like if God say take Christianity, right? Um God, it's really weird. I'm sorry that I'm does not compute right here, but yeah, I'm not really sure the best way to understand Christianity. Um because Jesus Christ is supposed to be the Son of God, but he also is God. Um so God has become Jesus, but then again, God is always also Jesus because of the this notion of the Holy Trinity, right? There's the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit. Those are supposed to be three aspects of one God. Um, well, no, we're not really our parents, right? In terms of identity, we're not our parents, right? Not in the way, not in identity, not in terms of identity. Um, yeah. Well, yeah, like how are we supposed to understand love if God is impassible? Like he loves us, but he doesn't feel love? What? That I don't understand that. Um, now I'm not trying to pick on Christianity, right? And indeed, there have been some pretty um vehement disagreements about the nature of the Holy Trinity throughout the history of Christianity, right? So, just because I don't understand that, it doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense. but it also may just not make sense. Um, well, that's the idea, right? Like God is supposed to be omnibenevolent, so there shouldn't be any evil, but there is, right? The example is the Lisbon earthquake. There was a really big earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, at the time, shortly before Voltaire was writing his book Candide, right? And kind of draws attention to all of the human suffering caused by this earthquake. And God is presumably the one who does the earthquakes. So either God caused the evil directly or he allows it to happen. And that's not very compatible with the notion of an all-loving God, right? It makes sense. Like if you're looking at the Greek pantheon, the Roman pantheon, the Indian pantheon, by that I mean the Hindu gods, the Norse gods, right? They're corruptible and subject to changes in mental states, just like we are. Um, God's not supposed to be like that in the Abrahamic religions, yet he kind of is, right? So yeah, well, exactly, right? And that's why I put the creation of Adam there, because God is depicted as this old man. Um, it's an anthropomorphization, right? And they do it on Family Guy, they do it on The Simpsons, right? Where God is this old white man. On The Simpsons, God is actually the only character to be drawn with four fingers. All the other characters have three fingers. Um, so that's kind of funny. Um, but yeah, God is supposed to have become a human, um, on Christianity anyway. So that seems to be kind of arguably an example that runs against God's immutability. Um, in the Old Testament or the Torah, depending on which tradition you come from, Abraham negotiates with God, right, to try and spare Sodom and Gomorrah. Let me just find a handful of good people, God, and then maybe don't destroy the city. I think he only finds like Lot and his family, and that's it. But again, I don't know the stories that well. I know that in Islam, for example, Muhammad. I think this takes place on the night journey, um, where Muhammad is supposed to have ascended to heaven and back, right? But someone correct me if I'm wrong. But he negotiates the required number of daily prayers down from 50 down to five, because Moses encouraged him to. So this idea, that Abraham or Muhammad can get God to change his mind says that he's not that immutable, um, right? He would certainly seem to be passable and corruptible in those examples because he's changing his mind about something, and not susceptible to feelings or emotions. I mean, have we read the Old Testament? I mean, God is an angry God. He's a jealous God. Um, you better not have any other gods before him, or you're going to he's going to come and smite you. Um, I mean, heck, he destroys entire civilizations. Um, he seems like he's not the kind of guy that you want to be on the angry side of. And this is again, maybe why we see God depicted. If I'll just go back, um, we see God depicted like this. Oh yeah, right. You have to sacrifice your that whole thing. Abraham, right? Got to sacrifice one of your sons. Got the firstborn. Oh, and then in Egypt, yeah, that whole yeah. Anyway, so God is depicted as an old man here. This is the God of the Bible, Yahweh, and these are some of his angels. But really, when you get down to the iconography, right, this is Zeus. God is always portrayed by Renaissance artists as almost as a Homeric god, right? And of course, Zeus, Jupiter, these were war gods. These were gods that controlled. They had the possessed the thunderbolt as their weapon. Who lived on Mount Olympus, right? So, Western human-like depictions of God are often modeled after Zeus or Jupiter. Both of their names, by the way, go back to an old Indo-European word, Deus Patar, I think, is how it would have been pronounced. And this word means sky father, right? So if you go back far enough, a lot of notions of God in the Western tradition are really tied to some very old understandings of God. In Islam, this is a little different, right? You don't you're not supposed to make graven images in Judaism or Christianity either, but you'll never find an anthropomorphic depiction of God in Islam. It's always either some kind of calligraphy, like writing God out in really nice calligraphy, or maybe it'll be like some kind of mathematical representation of the divine. So, uh, geometric patterns and stuff like that. Um, but you'll never see a human-like depiction. Anyway, let's get to the first of the three arguments. The first argument is the design argument. So I've got this watch here, and we'll see why, because William Paley famously um, used the analogy of finding a watch in the desert. So this is the design argument, or the teleological argument, as it's sometimes known. And what all versions of this argument have in common is that they look around. They're a posteriori arguments. They're empirical arguments. We look around the world and we say, there's enough evidence out there for us to conclude that there is design in nature. Birds' wings are for flying. Fish's fins are for swimming, so on and so forth, right? The chlorophyll in the leaves on the trees is for turning sunlight into food, right? We see design here, the argument goes. And if something is designed, it must have an end or a purpose. That's what this word, where this word teleological comes from. Teleo from telos, which is an end or purpose, or right? If you're Aristotle, that's your final cause. That's your purpose. That is what something is for. So if something is designed, it's designed for something. It must have an end or purpose. And if there is design, there must be a designer, and that designer must be God. That's how the argument goes. Yes, I agree, Milan. Yeah, evolution is a good enough explanation for the design, for the apparent. I would say, I would even qualify it. I would say the apparent or ostensive design. Although some of the thinkers that are quoted here, like Dawkins, say that well, there is design. It's just not intentional, right? It's not intelligent or intentional. That's what the blind watchmaker analogy is all about, right? Um, but for a long time, this was a pretty convincing argument. Even Aristotle himself understood nature teleologically. So he thought, well, what are the frogs for? Well, they're there for eating the flies and for feeding the birds. So the frogs eat all the insects, and they also work as a food source for the birds. So that's what frogs are for, right? They have a telos. So again, this is an a posteriori argument. We observe what we think is design in nature and thus infer the existence of a designer. And there's lots of examples, right? I said the 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 wings of a bird, or broadly speaking, all of the uh, ends that creatures have. Um, Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes or Julien Offray de la Mettrie would have included the human body. Um, the human body is a sort of natural machine, and it was created by an artificer. In fact, Lemaitre says if there is a revelation, it cannot contradict nature. So Lemaitre says, to heck with scripture. If you want to understand how God works, you have to actually look at what he created, nature, human beings, so forth. Nowadays, I think a lot of apologists would point to things like the structure of DNA. In fact, somewhat recently there's been this intelligent design movement, right, which tries to find examples of complexity in nature, like well, protein folding or the bacterial flagellum, or take your pick, any kind of molecular machinery you want. And they'll try to say it's too complicated to have evolved. The claim is not just that that there seems to be design. Um, the claim is that it has to have been designed, because it's too complicated to have come together on its own. Of course, evolution doesn't say that things spontaneously come together like that. Yeah, these arguments for design are still not really very good arguments. But this is probably the most famous argument for design. It's due to William Paley. He likened the works of nature to machines like watches. So he says here, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not admissible in the second case as it is the first? For this reason and for no other. When we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design, which existed in the watch, exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and in that degree, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. So Paley is saying, look, if you find, just a rock out there in nature, you probably don't think much of it. If you were to find a watchmaker, you would infer, or if you were to find a watch, you would have to infer a watchmaker. Someone had to have made the watch for a purpose, namely to tell time. But Paley says really all the works of nature are like this. All the works of nature show evidence of design far more complicated than that of a watch. So we should infer, Paley says, that there is some artificer, some designer, and that designer is, of course, God, or is supposed to be God. It doesn't necessarily have to be God, right? It could be gods. It could be aliens, right? It's not implicit. It's not necessarily implied that it's God, who is the designer, right? There's no reason in principle why an intelligent designer might not be a god, why it might be alien life or something like that. But that's probably the most famous argument, the most famous example of the design argument. There's another one called the fine-tuning argument. Um, on the fine-tuning argument, the idea is that if the cosmological constants, right, the sort of settings of the universe had been just a little bit different, say maybe the ratio of the strength of the electromagnetic force to the force of gravity were a little bit different, then life couldn't exist. Maybe. There are a few ways to respond to this. Um, oh no, no, that's what he's saying. Yeah, that's what he's saying. Since a watch implies a watchmaker, a rock would imply a rock maker. Well, more broadly, um, nature requires a nature maker, right? The idea is that nature is like a big clockwork mechanism. This is the 18th, the age of enlightenment. I forget which century. I think Paley was predominantly 18th century, but the idea that the universe is a machine was very in vogue, if you like, right? It was a mechanical view of the universe, right? We were discovering laws of physics that describe the motions of matter. Everything is just matter in motion. So it was a mechanical view of the universe. Everything was understood by analogy to a clockwork machine, clockwork mechanism, like a watch or a marine chronometer or an automaton, right? Everything from nature to the human being was understood mechanistically. Um, so yeah, nature is like a big clockwork mechanism. Uh, yeah, no, God didn't make the watch, but nature is supposed to be, all the things in nature are supposed to be like the watch in that way, right? That's what it means. So yeah, just to get back to the fine-tuning argument, there's the fine-tuning argument that we live in a fine-tuned universe. Maybe if the universe were tuned differently, life would have just turned out differently. Um, or maybe there are many universes, so there could be a multiverse, and we just happen to live in one of the ones that's suitable for life. That's another possibility, but we'll leave that there. Um, Now I have to say, even though I am an atheist, I kind of can't really stand Richard Dawkins. Um, Especially lately. He just seems to be on a bit of a supervillain arc. Um, but this is from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, where he discusses Paley's argument. Paley's argument, Dawkins says, is made with passionate sincerity and is informed by the best biological scholarship of Paley's day. But it is wrong, gloriously and utterly wrong. The analogy between watch and living organism is false. All appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind force of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin had discovered, and which we now know as the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has not purpose in mind. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. So, um, what's being said here is that natural selection means that we don't need a designer, because natural selection selects for traits that are advantageous to the organism. So traits that help an organism survive, traits that increase fitness, are selected for. Traits which don't do anything, or which are detrimental to the organism, are not selected for. So there is a kind of design, but it's not an intentional design if you're Dawkins, right? Sure, there's design in all kinds of creatures, like um opposable thumbs, right? We can grasp objects like coffee cups and whatnot because we have opposable thumbs. So in a set, there's a sense in the way that the human hand is designed for gripping, right? But really, is it designed intentionally? Well, no, not really. The design of the hand was something that was selected for. There was a time when hands were not hands, perhaps. But some of those proto hands were better at gripping than others. And those hands were selected for. And over time, the hand changes into a full-blown hand as opposed to something like, I don't know, a paw, right? Um, so there is design, it's just not intentional. Hume also argued against the design argument, right? David Hume, ever the empiricist, said, "Well, look, we can make this analogy, if we want to, but the fact of the matter is, while we have experience designing watches, none of us has experience at designing a universe. So, are we really justified in drawing this analogy, Paley? Right? Hume, like, do you have experience with that? No. Well, then shut up. Like that. He's such a hardcore empiricist. It's almost comical sometimes. Um. So anyway, Dawkins would say we could still identify purpose in nature. There's no intelligent design there. There's no intentional design there. Um, there's purpose, but it's purpose that's put there by the blind watchmaker, right? Why blind, right? As Dawkins says, evolution doesn't see the future. Evolution doesn't have intention in mind. Evolution just does the best it can with what it has, but the environment can change. So, the one of the important things about evolution that I think is not really emphasized in Crumley enough is that it's not teleological, right? A- Aristotle understood nature teleologically, and in fact, as Paley's argument illustrates, everyone, pretty much everyone, understood nature teleologically up until Darwin. Um, it was Darwin who said, well, okay, all these creatures aren't really for things. Um, Frogs are not really there to feed the birds and to eat the insects. That's just what they do. If the environment changed enough, frogs would have to change too, or they would go extinct, right? So yeah, it's not teleological. Evolution is not teleological. Um, Still, some say we can still use the notion of purpose. Um, Ernst Mayr says that purpose in nature is a result of natural laws or laws themselves, law in itself. He calls this teleonomy, so nomos, um, law, telos, and uh, Meyer would say that life forms behave purposively in the sense that they're following their genetic constructions, right? There's an internal principle, in this case, a genetic code or a genetic program, um, that determines the behavior of life down from the microscopic level. So, my RNA has a purpose. I have ribonucleic acid in all my cells, which carries instructions uh, for doing things, building different proteins and whatnot. And go back to the example of a hand. My hand has purpose in this sense. It's for grasping things, or maybe for helping me communicate, like wave my hands around, or if you speak sign language, right? So hands have purposes. Again, these are determined by one's genes, not by an artificer, right? So there are some pretty serious obstacles to the design argument. And yeah, recently, I would say, within the last 20 or 30 years, there's been almost a kind of renewed push for the intelligent design argument. But really, this is actually a very old argument. It's this argument. The argument for intelligent design is the teleological argument ultimately. Um, and it's I don't know, it's disconcerting to me that there are people trying to get this stuff put into science classrooms. Um, it might be fine to put it in a religious studies classroom. Um, but it's not. It should not be there in a science classroom. Of course, if you have philosophy class, you can also talk about it there, though, like we're doing right now. But yeah, the serious obstacles to this argument. And it seems like the more we learn about life, the more we learn that yeah, it's not designed, it's not teleological. It's not intentionally designed. Evolution is the blind watchmaker, right? Because it doesn't plan for the future. It cannot see the future. It just works with what it's got. Um, Now on to the cosmological argument, which we probably won't spend as much time on. There are lots of beings. I'm looking out my window and I'm seeing trees. I'm seeing birds. I'm seeing this cat. Hello, sir. Um, this couch. These are all beings, and their existences are all contingent upon something else. My existence is contingent upon my parents. Same goes for everyone who's in this class. Um, this couch, its existence is contingent upon there being or there having been a couch maker, right? But are there beings whose existence is necessary, that is not dependent on any other being, right? It could have been the case that I did not exist. My existence is not necessary in that sense, right? The example in the book is Back to the Future, right? Marty McFly goes back in time with Doc Brown, and at various points he interferes with time such that um, he might not have been born in the future. So Marty's existence is contingent upon his parents and upon things happening in a certain way in the past. But is there any being whose existence is necessary? Well, cosmological arguments try to show that God's existence is necessary, just like all of his divine attributes. Um, the idea here is like, is it contingently existing beings all the way down? Or is there some source of existence? Or you can look at it this way. You can look at it like, why is there something rather than nothing? Like there are things, there is something, things exist. And these things are caused by other things, but there must be some uncaused source for all of this, and that's God, right? This is an a posteriori argument, just like the design argument. And to see why, we need to turn to Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas writes, our experience certainly includes things capable of existing, but apparently unnecessary, contingent, since they come and go, coming to birth or dying. But if it is unnecessary for a thing to exist, it did not exist once upon a time. And yet everything cannot be like this, for if everything is unnecessary, there was once nothing. But if such were the case, there would now be nothing, because a non existent can only be brought into existence by something already existing. So that if ever there was nothing, not a thing could be brought into existence, and there would be nothing now, which contradicts the facts. And so not everything can be an unnecessary kind of being. There must exist some being that necessarily exists. But a thing that necessarily exists may or may not have this necessity from something else. But just as we must begin somewhere in a succession of causes, The case is the same with any succession of things that necessarily exist and receive this necessity from others. Hence, we are compelled to suppose that something that exists necessarily, having this necessity only from itself, in fact, it itself, the cause why other things exist. So I know that's a lot. But the idea basically is that God is an uncaused cause. God is an unmoved mover. It cannot just be unnecessary contingent beings all the way down, because unnecessary things can only be brought into existence by something that already exists. However, it can't just be an infinite regress. Right? If everything is unnecessary, there was once nothing, there would now be nothing, right? And things do exist. Therefore, there must be some necessary being whose existence, this being is necessary in the sense that its existence is not contingent upon any other being. And it is the original cause, the prime mover, the unmoved mover, the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause. This, by the way, is the third way. It's the third out of 5 ways, which are 5 arguments that Thomas Aquinas offers for the existence of God. So what do we make of this? There's a lot I'm skipping over in this subsection of the textbook. But I just thought we could finish today by having some discussion about this. Does this idea of God as an uncaused cause make sense to you? Or is it like an extra step that we could perhaps save ourselves just by saying that the universe could be uncaused? Well, I mean that God exists, and God causes everything else to exist, but nobody caused God to exist. God just is. God is uncaused, or if you like, self-caused. Nothing external to him caused him to exist or brought him into existence. Yeah, that's right. Maybe God is not a personal God. This could be a deistic God that we're talking about, an impersonal, cold, indifferent God who simply created the universe and then stepped away from it, right? Well, this is a tricky one because it's empirical. People can always just disagree with the argument, right? Yeah. Um, yeah, Robin, I think that's important to consider. For me anyway, I agree with that line of reasoning. And then maybe this plays into what Tiana is saying, right? Everyone has different opinions and believes differently. I mean, I think that this would be a case of special pleading, right? If oh, we need some uncaused cause. Well, God, okay, it's God. But why? Like, aren't we just adding an extra step? Maybe the universe can be self-causing in the way that some people imagine God is self-caused or uncaused. Um, or maybe, or maybe, and this is another possibility that's mentioned in the textbook. Maybe it is really just an infinite series of beings contingent upon other beings, infinitely back and going infinitely forward. I mean, we don't know. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, Jose, you have trouble. You have a hard time imagining an uncaused cause. I guess I do too. Um, but I'm not sure why it's necessary for our uncaused cause to be God. Like it's kind of like when people ask what happened before the Big Bang, they would say no. They would say, well, maybe what happened before the Big Bang was that there was God, and God created the universe. And I'd say, well, what about God? Who created God? Well, God has no creator. Okay, but why? Why can't the universe just be that? It's, you see what I mean? It's some would say it's special pleading. Um, yeah, cyclical time theories are pretty common in polytheistic religions too, but I'm not sure that many of them say that it's the case that we create ourselves. Um, although you could maybe make an argument that this is true in some sense in some religions. Oh, now there's a woodpecker out there. There's some talk about design. I've got a woodpecker on the tree outside of my window. Woodpeckers would seem ostensibly designed to handle, all the pecking. Um, but of course, those traits were selected for. Oh, there she goes. I think that's a female downy woodpecker. I wonder if you can see it. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'm not sure if any of you can see it, but there is a woodpecker out there. It's on my bird feeder. Oh, flew away. I'm not sure if I had the camera angled right or if you can even see it because it's so bright out there. Um, but yeah. Yeah, you're right. It would violate Occam's razor. Yeah, an extra unnecessary step. You're right, both of you. Um, but yeah, no, Tiana, you're right. I mean, like whether one accepts or rejects these arguments depends on background assumptions for sure. Um, the design argument could use it to argue there's life after death. Some people might. Some people might do that. Um, I think Descartes understands humans as being intelligently designed in a sense, for example, and he's a substance dualist. So on some variants of substance dualism, life after death would be possible. Um, and the Abrahamic religions seem pretty dualist as well, right? The soul is what is really you. It is what is essentially you, and it's of course created and given to you by God. It exists uh, before you're created. Um, in Christianity they say, before God knew you before you were born, right? God had the blueprint or the recipe. In Islam, you've got like your primordial self, the being that you really are. Um, and you get this kind of forgetfulness of your divine nature and that's why you've got to submit to God to sort of rediscover it, right? Um, yeah, I don't know. I always personally, I find it, I always find it's a real challenge to explain arguments for and against God's existence when you're an atheist, right? Um, uh, because I have to be, I have to try and be charitable. I don't want to be a Richard Dawkins, um, you know, because Dawkins is not charitable. I would actually like to try and be charitable towards some of these arguments. But at the same time, I don't accept any of the arguments, right? I don't really buy any of them. So I do my best, but it's tricky. Um, but anyway, that's the point of the cosmological argument, and this is the takeaway where so they're both a posteriori arguments, right? So I'll just go to my last slide here. They're both a posteriori arguments. There is, we look around the world and we see some evidence for the existence of God. The design argument, that evidence is purposeful design in nature. So design for a purpose requires a designer. That designer it is argued is God. The cosmological argument says, well, look around, there is something, not nothing, right? And everything that exists exists comes and goes. It's all contingent upon something else. Everything that exists is contingent upon everything that did not at one time exist is contingent upon something having existed to bring it into existence. So there must be some necessary being, because otherwise you've either got an infinite regress or nothing would exist, and clearly something exists. So the source of that something must be God. So these are both a posteriori arguments. But next time we'll look at the ontological argument from Saint Anselm, and this is an a priori argument for God's existence. This argument says that God necessarily exists. It's in God's nature. God, if he is to be the perfect being, must necessarily exist. Existence requires perfection. Now it's an extraordinarily simple argument, but it's also kind of tricky to get your head around if you're thinking about it for the first time. So we'll go through it together slowly next time, and then we'll get to the problem of evil, which of course asks whether the existence of evil is compatible with an omnibenevolent God. So kind of along the lines of what Epicurus said, if you if you admit that there is evil, then that's not really compatible with an all-loving God. If God really is all loving, then maybe what we think is evil, what we understand as evil, is not really evil. Yeah, that's the long and short of it, as it were. Well, that's really all I have for today. Thanks, everyone. Sure, quick question about the essay. Go ahead. Yeah, and thanks everyone else who joined today. I'll see you on Wednesday for our final lecture from the textbook.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi. So on my essay, I'm doing the topic that we were talking about today.
Okay.
I wanted to use like the five ways and like Saint Aquinas as like reasoning why, but I was wondering like while you're grading the essay, like does it matter what view you take and like if you don't believe the arguments that I'm saying, will that like make my grade go down?
No. Well, you have to have good arguments. The
Mm.
arguments just have to be clear and well supported by reasons. So, if you're whether it doesn't matter whether you argue um, for the existence of God or against the existence of God. If you're arguing for the existence of God, your grade would depend on, say, how well you explain the cosmological argument and how well you defend it from criticisms.
Okay.
Um, and if you argue that, if you decide to argue against the cosmological argument, of course, your mark would depend on how well you do that. Like, how clearly do you do that, and how good are your reasons? It's not really, it's not like, just say I don't believe in God. I'm not going to give you a lower mark if you argue that God does exist, or something like that, right? It's going to depend entirely on the quality of the argument that you use. And for an example, I mean, you can just see what Crumley does in this chapter, right? He explains the argument, he explains counter arguments, and then he explains responses to those counter arguments. That's the kind of thing you're going to want to do in your paper.
Okay, so like I was just confused because I can show like the counter arguments or like the criticism towards this specific theory from this philosopher, but then I should prove why this criticism is like false in a way.
Yeah, you should try and respond to it. It's kind of like a conversation, like a dialectic. Like, okay, so Aquinas says this, and his critics say this, but I say this, right? Like that.
Okay, so I can give my opinion.
Well, you're not really giving an opinion. What you're giving an argument, right? You want, so it's not mere opinion. It's like it's backed up by reasons,
Oh, I see.
right?
Yeah.
Like kind of like right, think back to the bits from the Mino that we talked about. Opinions are great if they're right, but if you have knowledge or true belief, you know, if we have something fastened down with evidence, that's better than opinion, right? So that's what you're going, that's really what you're doing. Even though you're talking about what you believe and why you believe it, but it's not really just opinion, because you're giving reasons for why you believe what you believe.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how
Okay.
I would think of it.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anything else? Oh, Becky asks, is the essay due at 11:59 p.m. on Friday? Yes, it is. December 8th. That is the due date. All right. Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a good one. We'll see you on Wednesday. Bye for now.